right, Mia. It is late January, and I've just finished reading Hodgson Burnett's The Secret Garden, another children's piece. Doing some serious stat padding here at the beginning of the year. This is, I think, book 12 that I read in January, or finished in January, so yeah. But that's besides the point. This is a piece of literature. I definitely read this at some point in elementary school. I was probably in the 3rd or 4th grade, I would guess. And then it kind of popped up on a whole bunch of these, top 100 books to read or whatever. And so, it is what it is. It's very interesting in comparison to the other children's literature I've been reading recently, right? Because it is a chapter piece and it is a longer chapter piece. It's still very easy to read and everything, but it's definitely a little bit longer. And it's also centered and focused around children that are not perfect, right? Which I think is very interesting. Because a lot of children's literature, at any given point, the vast majority of it is focused around children that are already good and positive in some way and has those like Victorian values. And then like something goes slightly wrong and they go back to being good, right? Versus this, right, in which are out of the 3 main children, 2 of them would be considered very, very terrible children to have. And it's just very, very interesting, right? It's about their growth and finding themselves and yada, 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 yada. So fascinating stuff. There's a lot of other components here too, right? There's a lot of classism involved. Both in a positive aspect and in a negative aspect. And the negative aspects also heavily involve race, and the intersectionality between poverty and race, and looking very, very much down on people that are Indian and poor and servants, right? Just a very, very negative view of them, right? But then a very positive view of poor Yorkshire people. Very, very positive look of them, right? And it's definitely a race thing. It's definitely a subservience thing. It is also definitely an aspect of, you could definitely look at this as an aspect of Burnett. What's the best way to phrase it? I guess like taking a favorability to the common life or the regular social life of the average English person, but not taking the same view of of India, right? So yeah. And that's a pretty continuous theme, especially with the love of the kind of the common English folk, and it's just one of those things where it's very interesting that like the common English folk and their lives are intended to spark this sense of joy and sense of commonality and sense of raising children the right way, but the common Indian folk is meant to show subservience and this unwillingness to do the right thing, and in some ways occultish items and things, which is very, very, you know, yeah. But yeah. That's all fascinating. That's all, there's certainly a lot to talk about with that. But yeah. You also have something that I think is very interesting for children's literature, which is parallel storylines. Because you have Mary, who is our first spoiled child, and the character that we follow throughout most of the book, and her life is such that she is raised in India, but her parents basically don't want anything to do with her, and so she is raised by Indian servants, and the power dynamics and the classism is such that Mary gets to do whatever she wants and gets to just throw a fit about everything, and everything will be given to her. But then also she hates India, and therefore is a constantly sickly child, which is very destructive, yada, 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 yada. She goes to, basically everyone in the house dies of a cholera outbreak, and she's like the only survivor. She ends up moving to be with her uncle, I think it is, up in England, and then learns to take care of herself and be one with herself and be healthy and yada, yada, yada. While she's also doing that, she then meets Colin, who is her cousin, and Colin is just her, but having been raised in England, of where Colin is, his mother had died during childbirth. I believe that's the story. And so his father hates him, and doesn't want to be around him, and they think that he is a sick child, and so they basically coop him up all the time, and he gets to do whatever he wants because all these people are subservient to him. And it takes Mary, who is just as strong-willed and just as obstinate as Colin, to get him into being a quote-unquote good child and whatnot. Yeah. And then everything goes well. There's a happy ending, yada, yada, yada. Colin gets better. Dad gets better. Mary's great. Dickon is great. Dickon, who just tames animals for fun. Yada, 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 yada. Yeah. There's a good amount that the moralistic teachings that it tries to give, right? A lot of moralistic ideas about, you need to be outside, you need to be an active person or to be a good person, right? That you need to, to be raised in a way that where you or only hear yes or you only hear no are just as terrible things, and end up raising terrible children. Yeah. I mean, just like kind of basic stuff like that, right? Yeah. I think it's one of those pieces of literature, especially with children's literature, of where I understand why it is so beloved in a lot of senses, but it's also one of those pieces of like, it gets a lot of nostalgia points, for being probably one of the early, like, coming of age moralistic pieces that a lot of people read, right? Because it's not like the language is hard, right? The hardest part is getting used to some of the Yorkshire writing, right? And just being comfortable with how they phrase things. But after that, like, it's a very, very simple piece of literature. And so I feel like it gets a lot of points for being that. Right. I have just recently gotten onto Goodreads, and I haven't looked at the star rating of every single book, but it seems very much to me of every single piece of literature that is considered a classical piece of literature kind of ends up like at around the 3.7 to 4 point something range, right? And because I would argue that a lot of that is because either people are saying that it is a classic and therefore it needs to be rated highly because we say it's a classic, or if people don't like it, then they say it's a one star and questioning why it's a classic, right? And then you get these kind of weird ratings, and then you get some ratings that because they are children's literature or they are literature that is either difficult to read or is not as popular, they end up with like really high scores because they, and I would assume this also goes for a lot of nonfiction pieces as well, they end up with really high scores because the only people that are reading these and then rating them are the people that are actively interested in this stuff, right? Which is also why I think it's great for me to be a person who is reading a whole bunch of literature that I do not like as well, or even I think is just okay, right? One I can name off the top of my head, just because I'm thinking about it, is like all of the Wizard of Oz pieces are like a 4.2 or like a 4.3 or something, and they're clearly not that, right? But the only people who are getting to the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th book of the Wizard of Oz series are people who like it, right? And therefore they're going to give it really high ratings. Versus, I think Moby Dick has like a 3.7 or 3.8 or something, maybe even 3.6. And it's just a lot of people that start reading it and then stop and then give it a 1 star because they think it's a classic, and people say that they should read it, and then it turns out to be either a very difficult read or a read that is not what they were expecting, right? So, I don't know. That's that. That's The Secret Garden. That's that. Anyways.